To be a better marketer, it helps to get insights directly from prospects and customers. And in theory, sales calls are a goldmine of valuable information about our prospects, their pain points, and how your solutions can help. But here's the reality. Most marketing teams rarely, if ever, actually listen to these calls. There's simply not enough time in the day to sift through hours of recordings trying to extract meaningful comments. That's why in this episode, we'll get into the world of analyzing sales calls with AI, and we'll show you how to automatically transform your sales call recordings into information that you and your marketing team can actually use. So get ready to bridge the gap between sales conversations and marketing strategies, all while also saving you time and giving you an edge as a marketer. Okay, I think every day I see on LinkedIn that if you're a marketer, listen to sales calls, and this will help you be a better marketer. But I think that it's a process that's hard to kind of like get your arms around. Like, what does that actually mean, and how can I do this consistently and more often? Like, Jacob, what do you see or what do you think about when you hear that term? Like, as a marketer, like how you're tapping into some of these conversations that sales is having.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every marketer would agree, yes, that's something I would love to do. But the reason it doesn't happen, there's a bunch of them, one of which is often simply like access to sales teams. Companies can be really, really siloed. And to be frank, there's very little short-term incentive for a salesperson to spend a bunch of time just walking through a call that they already had with a marketer in a totally different department. So there's a lot of misalignment naturally there. And so you end up relying on like social capital essentially to buddy up with one of the sales guys, which nothing's wrong with that, but it doesn't result in a lot of those conversations happening. So I think the access is one thing. The other thing I would add is just the nature of subjective interpretation around this stuff. Right. So if your company has multiple salespeople, you might on the same call, one maybe newer salesperson thinks that call went amazing. They had no objections. We crushed it. It was great, marketing person. That's what you got to learn from this one. Whereas a maybe more experienced or even just maybe a more pessimistic salesperson might be in the same call, raise a bunch of objections that the person has. Maybe some of them were just looking too far into it. So there's just so many layers of subjectivity to the interpretation of how a call went that unless you are sitting next to them, there's a lot of, the data is not great, to be honest. And so you might take wrong lessons from it. But I think at the end of the day, when marketers are doing this, the access is a really big one. And then the just how good is the information I'm collecting? Is this one call I'm reviewing, right? Scalability is another thing. You can only review so many, and you don't want to be pulled to a certain action because of one weird sales call you happen to pick to review. So there's a lot of things. There's maybe a couple of them though.
Yeah, and access is a big piece, Jacob. And I'm curious, Grant. Do you think or do you feel that is a big roadblock as to why marketers don't take advantage of sales calls more often? Do you think it's access? Is it just like, it's something that I should do, but I just don't have the time? Kind of like going to the gym for people. It's like, I should go to the gym every day, but I can't fit it in sometimes. Like, what's your take on that?
Man, the number of times I've looked at myself in the mirror and said, I'm going to listen to a sales call today, and then I didn't listen to a sales call today is too many, way too many. And I think it's a scalability thing, as Jacob was pointing out. It's like we all want to sit through a 30-minute call or multiple 30-minute calls and hear those objections and hear the tonality, see where their eyes lit up. But we've all got 1,000 other things on the roadmap that needs to be done yesterday. So exactly like what you were talking about, the ROI of sitting through a 30-minute call is a mystery, which is why it can be hard to convince yourself to sit and put that time on the calendar to actually go and do that thing. So with the way that recordings and Fathom note takers are becoming more common, accessibility might be an issue. I think people are getting more used to recording their calls and making those links available. But I think the scalability of it is like, I just don't have 30-minute call that I want to pause, rewind. Like that's a good hour, So what is going to be my ROI on that hour? I don't know when I open up that link.
Yeah, and I think so. You're mentioning kind of these tools that are available now. I'm dating myself a little bit, but we didn't have note takers that popped into Zoom and recorded calls back in the day, and you literally had to listen to a recording, and you had to go through it, and and I know that was painful then. And now we have these tools, so virtually every meeting is recorded. I mean, we're on a conversation here that's recorded. And so then I think it's almost flipping the other way now where there's so much data. So that actually is becoming a problem. It's like, oh, I can always listen to sales calls. They're just filed away in the sales call folder, or they're, in our, we use Fireflies at our agency. So, we can just pop in and check the recordings at any time we want. But there's no system there. So like, Grant, how do you think about that? Whereas like all of this data, but it's almost creating another problem. I mean, what's your take there?
Yeah, I mean, there's got to be an expression for when you've got so many. It's like, what is it? The paradox of choice. You've got 1,000 different things that you could be doing. How am I going to choose one, right? And you can sit in that comfort of knowing they're always there. Maybe I'll have a free afternoon one day. Never comes, right? So I think there is definitely something to be said about the glut of data that we now have. How am I going to make this actionable? Or one day I'll get back to it, but it just, at least in my experience, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think we all suffer from something very similar. So if we think about how to actually tap into the gold that does exist in these sales calls. I mean, the three of us here, we all know that there's a lot of valuable information there that can actually translate into better marketing. Jacob, I'll kick it to you. Like, what could this look like if we did want to develop more of a systematic process and actually automate some of this and make it easier for marketers to tap into that? I'll let you walk through the screen share here.
Definitely. So what this looks like exactly will vary depending on the technology your team uses, the processes your team has, how your sales team conducts these calls. But what I have here is just a high level overview of what it could look like and a very simple version of what it could look like. So as I zoom in here, there are 4 different stages to building something like this. Stage 1 is to get the transcript. Because, Tristan, as you mentioned, these tools are being used pretty prolifically across sales teams. If they're not, they really should. But frankly, most of the time, people have Fireflies, they have Otter, they have Fathom, they have whatever. Those are recorded, and then they sit in a platform, and nothing is ever done with them. And so the hope here is that we can actually stretch this and get a lot of information. But to do so, we need it to be in written format. That's one of the first steps to this, is to get a transcript of that conversation. And these tools, Fireflies, for example, have plenty of technology to identify speakers and things like that. So you can get a really solid, accurate transcript of what happened at that meeting and how the conversation went, and even deeper things like tone and all of that. But we'll get to that in a moment. So step 1 is to get that transcript. We need that information. Step 2 is where an AI layer comes in. And this could vary dramatically based on what you as an organization are looking to accomplish and what you want to do with this information on the marketing side of things. And so we in this process of outlining kind of 2 tools or 2 stages to this. First of all is call tagging. Now, this could be something as simple as maybe the stage of the funnel, the sales call. Is it like an initial discovery call? Is it walking through a contract at the very end? And so tagging them in some way like this will be helpful, because the objections that someone brings up on the first call are not the objections that they bring up on the final sales call in most kind of complicated sales processes that are kind of big ticket items. There's going to be an evolution that happens. And so we want to take that into account. So maybe it is like a sales funnel, but you can tag that however you want. We've actually been playing a lot with letting AI tag it itself. And we find a lot of information in how AI just kind of objectively views those conversations. But that's maybe a longer conversation for another day. But we do want to tag and organize those.
And Jacob, real quick,
Please.
before you do go on to the next piece, like why categorize or something, why provide a tag or that data element? Why is that important, do you think?
Yeah. So when we're creating workflows like this, I'm always starting with where I want to go. Right. So I think about how am I going to use this data? What am I going to do with it? And one of the ways as a marketer, I'm going to want to use this is to identify what messages to focus on different assets that I have. And so some of my assets, maybe some of the main pages on the website, are going to be very top of the funnel. And so those initial conversations are really what I want to focus on from an analysis standpoint. Whereas if I'm creating I don't know, maybe mid-funnel case study or even deeper, some sales material, helping the sales team out, I'm going to focus on different things, different maybe pricing concerns they have or questions about the pricing model, as opposed to how we're different than a competitor, for example, that might be a little bit higher funnel before those conversations start. And so how you tag, and this is why I really left it kind of vague here in the presentation, is how you tag depends on what you want to do with that information. Funnel-based tagging is one way. Maybe you also want to tag via different personas or ICPs that you have, because they're going to struggle with different things. And so when you're making an industry page, when I analyze this data later, I don't want to analyze everybody at the same time. I want to focus in on the persona or ICP that I'm talking about in that context. So what exactly I'm tagging will vary, but it varies based on where I'm trying to go and what I'm going to build with it. Whether it be funnel or ICP or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's helpful for sales calls. This, also can apply. I know we do something similar with content. There needs to be some way to logically group things or filter later on, and I think that's an important piece here to note, because once again, just back to something we were talking about, is if you have so much data, it's not helpful if you just keep stacking data on top of more data. Like there needs to be some organization to it. And I think this is an important thing here. You can, with OpenAI inserted here, you could provide a list of categories and force it to pick one out of 10 perhaps, or you can kind of make it a little bit more free form where it takes its own liberty. So I think that's just an important thing to think about, because this can apply to a lot of things. We're talking about sales calls here, but this type of categorization can be inserted pretty much in a lot of workflows.
Well, there's also an important middle ground. So we've talked about just giving it 5 tags to pick from. So maybe it's like the industries you serve. And we've talked about, hey, AI, go do your thing and just organize it in some way that makes sense. Well, the middle ground is really useful to maybe you want to tag by objections. Well, maybe the top objections based on what the sales team has told you, but if you give the AI tool a little bit more flexibility and a really good prompt around identifying the list of objections from that call, you actually might discover things that you didn't know existed. And so you'll find that you don't want to limit AI too much, but you also don't want to give it so much freedom that it's tagging arbitrarily based on things you don't care about. So that's where you get into a lot of the prompting conversation, is what is a good prompt when it comes to building workflows like this. Probably for another conversation, but to your point, super important to think about kind of the end guiding you there. The next step in this, so we have the tagging element, is to create some content from it. As we talked about earlier, turning a 30-hour-long 60 minute call into a 8-page transcript doesn't save you any time if you're going to sit there and read it. And so that's another area where AI is really good at not only analyzing and tagging, but also summarizing and pulling key things out. And so I listed a couple right here under what this kind of note taker AI tool could do. So I already mentioned objections, maybe key questions the prospect asked, goals, what they're going to use the product or service for. Even we can get into things like action items from the sales team or important dates to consider. But again, just like the tagging, what we want to think about is at the end, what am I going to use this for? So I already gave some examples for objections, but questions are really important. So if a call happens on the sales team and you keep seeing the same question, that's a gap in your marketing material. That's something your website is not answering very well. And so you can then pull that information later, analyze it, and then answer those questions earlier and really feed that into your strategy. And knowing that, kind of going back or taking a bigger picture note here, is when you're doing stuff like that, or like this, everyone knows it's important to listen to sales calls, but oftentimes when they're pushed and the question is asked, well, why, they fall back on some loose answer like, It's good for messaging. I don't know. It's good for me to know. I'm writing content, so I should know. And that's all true, but it can get so much more tactical than that. And that's really what I'm thinking through when I'm creating this call, is when I am in, maybe let's just say, the manual process of when I'm listening to a sales call, what am I listening for and why am I listening for that? I'm listening to objections because I want to answer those in the materials that I'm having, or I want to listen for pain points because those are really good hooks in ads that I'm writing, or I'm listening for goals on how to use the product. There's famous stories across baking soda, I think it is, that they learned that people were using it to like brush their teeth. This is recorded, so I don't know if I'm way wrong here, but there's something like that. Like, people use your products for different things.
We'll fact check that later.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's good for post. But my point is, they might be even simpler, an easier example. They might be experiencing a pain and using your product to solve a pain that you're not even talking about. Because we take a lot of that stuff for granted. So anyway, those are just a couple of things we can have here, but just my main message in this AI section, because it's so flexible, is to know where you're going with it and why you're collecting and creating that information. But that's this AI layer. Now, what to do with that? So got the transcript, we had some analysis done, we created some content, some summaries. Well, there are two things I want to do. Number one is a notification. One of the gaps that we kind of hinted at between the marketing and sales team is that they're looking at different data sets when they're building their knowledge of their customer. So the sales team is building their knowledge and data set in their minds based on sales conversations, whereas the marketer is building their knowledge based on like website behavior or ads that are performing the best. And those are, in many ways, they're not ever gonna, like, they don't overlap in the way that we think they do, because these people are at different stages of the funnel. The marketing team is really high in the funnel, so some of the metrics they're seeing are actually not a fit and not ICP at all. So there's a bunch of reasons that happen. And so the reason this notification is so important is that it allows the marketing team to just like track along, right? Just read a 150-word summary as sales go through, and they'll start to get a much stronger idea based on the metrics they're looking at in a marketing standpoint and the conversations happening in the sales standpoint, and marrying those two data sets together in a way that very rarely happens. Like, that's one of the big benefits of a automation like this, is that just like alignment of the marketing and sales team, and that misalignment often happens because there's a lot of tension because they're seeing data in different ways and from different sources. So again, more we can go into there, but I do want a notification of some vehicle for notification happening. But I also want to reference that later. So this isn't gonna, depending on how big your company is, if you get 9 of these a day from a team of salespeople working through this, you're not going to read them all or really dive deep into them, at least. And so we want that information to be collected for later analysis, right? And that analysis is useful, not just to like reference a call, but more so to take a bigger picture view on things. And some of those examples I mentioned earlier, what are the biggest objections? What are the pain points people are experiencing? What are they using the product for outside of these 3 ways that we directly market towards? And so that analysis requires that we collect that. There is a break, which Grant will get to in a little bit, around kind of how automations like this will work and where they exist in a Google Drive, but I'm not going to dive into that too much here. And then I want that in the CRM. And the sales team, one of the at least in my experience, the thing a salesperson hates the most is prepping all for a call, having that call, and writing 30 minutes worth of notes inside the CRM. Well, you can actually kind of do the sales team a nice favor here by adding some call summaries, some action items. That's kind of where I was going here, important dates, directly into that CRM field. Maybe you do fields, maybe you add activities, maybe you link to a document. There's a million ways to do that. We focused more on fields in this example, but this could look like a lot of different things. And it's important to go and ask your sales team what they're looking for when you're doing this as well, so you can, build some of that social capital to dive into things as you need. But a lot of detail that we could go into here. I'm trying to keep it fairly high level, but every company is going to need some sort of transcript development, some sort of AI layer to do something with that and to build upon that data set, and then to keep that information there, and then notification. So those are really the 4 things that we're looking at, and we'll kind of go into the weeds on what a version of that could look like.
Yeah. So Grant, let's switch over to you and uncover how we actually would build this out, and a lot of interesting avenues here as far as like categorizing information, storing it for later, that hopefully breaks down that issue of like, even though this data will continue to pile up, there is a method to the madness so that we can actually find the most interesting things from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, 100%. And Jacob, thanks so much for laying that out. The one thing I'll talk about real quick before I get into all the details is the beauty of what Jacob just did is showed a lot of options for what could fit your team, right? It's like we're showing the extra wide version of the shoe, but you're gonna narrow that down to fit exactly how you want it to. So maybe you want a big summary field in your CRM. Maybe you want the email to go to someone on your team instead of a Slack message. Like, as you get more exposed to automation and these tools and what they're capable of, that's how you're going to find that glass slipper that fits your business. So just want to point out that that's a really important piece of this, is getting exposed to the ideas should hopefully help get that idea engine going in you. So kicking this thing off, on our team we use Fathom. So Fathom's going to be our trigger here. New transcript is generated. I'm just going to immediately store that in a Google Doc, right? And so the title is the name of the person that was attending it for me. I've got the recording URL here. I've got the share URL here as well. So if I wanted to pull this up and immediately share it with someone else externally, I could. And again, these things can be present anywhere else in the flow. But the last piece of this is just a plain text transcript. So with the timestamps and everything, who's talking, that's just going to go and fill up the rest of that document. So we immediately have a record inside of a Google Doc, which we'll store and save later. But when we were talking about tagging, the thing that I thought of was, let's go ahead and just do a quick text to sentiment. So is this person excited? What are they, how do they feel about the conversation? It's a very easy module to add in to say, what is the energy level of this person? You could very easily use any of the derivatives that Jacob was talking about earlier. But I thought this was a pretty easy one, and also a fun one to showcase to people who are watching this, that text sentiment could be a fun way to get a quick snippet or a quick overview of how did this call kind of go in general. That's what I think this sentiment module or step is really useful for. So I'm not going to go into too many of the details on the technical side of this, but I just put in the text, the plain text to be analyzed. And then that temperature, that's kind of the model's creativity level on a scale of 0 to 1. So I put it at 0.5. Pretty simple, just as a safe bet, and just the latest ChatGPT model.
How do you... Oh, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, how do you decide which AI model to use for different tasks? I see you're about to get into a wholly different one here. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say when it comes to more of like the creative writing and I don't know, more on the creative side of things, I lean more towards ChatGPT. And when I'm looking for more analytical, like hard answers, hard reasoning, that's where I'll go more on the Anthropic side and ChatGPT, OpenAI, you know what I mean? And so when I'm looking for really specific answers inside of that text summary, that's where I'll go into an Anthropic, a Claude model in there. And then for the most part, it's like you can't really go wrong by going with the latest model. I think that's a pretty safe bet across the board. So some people, like especially when you're using OpenAI, some models have the vision capability, so you can submit an image. Some of them don't, right? Sometimes the Anthropic model will have it, sometimes it won't. So that's probably one thing that you should definitely look out for if you think you're going to be using image recognition and description. But for the most part, analysis, I'm looking at Claude Anthropic models. And so I was thinking when we looked at this, the field approach was going to be how I thought this would be the most valuable for my team. So I was thinking, let's go through and ask Claude for those objections, for those questions, those goals. And the reason that these are individual and not one huge one prompt to kind of do all 5, is because we want those outputs to be separated. And there are much nerdier ways to do this, but personally, I think it's pretty easy just to say one model or one prompt, one output. So that's a fairly straightforward rule that I try to follow to make sure that the model doesn't get too confused. I want just the objectives. When you look at it this time, just give me the objectives. Then after that, give me just the questions that were asked. And so if we go into this, we can see again, we've got a system prompt that's just a little bit of background on who I am and what our company does. And I said, hey, you're a CRM wizard looking for only the most important information in the call transcript related to closing this deal. And so when we're looking at these messages, we're saying, what were the main objections of the prospect on the call? Your response should not have an introduction, just give me the answer. And that came from a little bit of prompt engineering I did. I saw that there was a little bit of fluff at the beginning, just an opening sentence. The objections from this call were, and I was like, no, I don't want that. Just give me the objections. And so I did a very similar prompt for all of these, identifying the questions, the goals, the action items, and the dates. And I think it was the action items where I asked for bullet points. Your response should have no introduction, just the answers. Additional context as bullet points here. So you can throw in a few things there, but this is a very simple rule to follow, one prompt for one output. I'll pause there.
Yeah, one question. So you're separating those out just to get very clear inputs, outputs, and maybe you'll get into this, like, how does that help you, like, downstream from maybe where you want to assemble all this information into something else? Like, kind of what's the driver behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. So then I'm going to update my CRM, and in this case, I'm just going to go straight to creating a contact. And I'm going to say, hey, what are the action items? I made some fields. Actually, these custom fields already existed, like conversion information, action items. So I said, let's go ahead and just drop in the action items response. Now, if those were all together in one prompt, and I said, give me the action items, give me the dates, give me the goals, objections, etc., all in one step in Zapier, then I would not be able to separate them out later unless I did some technical mumbo jumbo. So having one prompt for one output allowed me to map those responses to specific fields. So you can think about it as like one rectangle here equals one rectangle in HubSpot. And so that's where all that information goes.
The other thing I like about you breaking it out is it's easier to manage down the road. Like, yes,
Totally.
you could have it, build a bunch of answers, give separators, and then separate those later. But like when you make a change, that downstream impact is going to be a lot more technical to resolve.
Completely agree. Maintenance and scalability is definitely something we want to keep in mind when building any automation. It's like I always ask the team, let's put this automation through the 10x and the 1000x question. At 10x, the throughput, let's say your company grows 10 times. Does the automation still do what we want it to do? Like, do we think it's going to break or get annoying at any point to maintain? And at 1000x, does the human on the other side who's dealing with the outputs, are they still happy with the outputs that they're getting if the automation is working the way it does, right? Is it still useful at 1000x as a thought experiment? Because if the output is, a Slack message that's going to be 3 paragraphs long, well, at 1000x, are they going to love that experience? Maybe not, right? Maybe we should slim down these messages and really make them much more concise with a link so that if I find something interesting, I can click on the link and go to that record. So there's definitely some kind of thought experiments on either side of the spectrum that we can do and make sure we solve the short-term goal and the long-term goal. So continuing on through here, now Jacob had mentioned this little nuance with Zapier and Google Drive. So if you remember, this very second step was let's save all this information into a Google Doc. Now, one thing that's interesting about Zapier is that when I create a Google Doc, I can only create it in my drive. Okay, so my Grant Hushek Google Drive. But we do everything on our shared drive. And so a nuance is that I have to actually go and find the folder that I want to save this information in and then move my file to that folder. So intuitively, I would think, hey, I'm going to create a Google Doc and I'm just going to save it where I want to save it right off the bat. But if you're using a shared drive system, which I know a lot of people who are listening will be, then we're going to need to go and find the folder that we want. And so I did that. I looked for the name of the folder that I was looking for, which drive it's in. So it's in the GrantBot Process Consulting Team drive. I go and find that folder ID, and then I can move that file, that Google Doc, just very easily into that drive. Okay, so that's a small little nuance that I think we talked about this earlier. It can be frustrating dealing with some automation the first time around, but as you start to get to know the platform better, you pick up on some of these nuances, and then you just kind of, it just works its way into your operating system when you're building automation. And so finishing this thing out, the last part of this is sending a Slack message to the team. I know Jacob had talked about providing a longer summary. Again, we're just trying to expose you to what's possible. So I took a different approach. I said, hey, here's a sales call breakdown for this meeting, and then here's a link to the HubSpot contact record. And so if I actually, let's see if I can zoom in on this. This is a little, technical Zapier knowledge here. To do a hyperlink inside of a message, really anywhere, I think you need to have this syntax. And so this is a bracket, and that's not a bracket. What do we call these things? Carrots? No, that's the one that points up.
I just think greater or less than.
Greater or less than. That
was
works for me.
That's my technical answer.
So we're doing less than most of the HubSpot URL. Up to here, this is up to this one. This is just the company link, and then I'm adding in the HubSpot ID from the contact I created. So when I get this Slack message, it's going to say HubSpot contact, and that's hyperlinked right to this person's contact, which is pretty neat. So then we're going to put in our sentiment analysis. It's neutral on this one, and then we'll also link the Google Doc if anyone wanted to go and reference that Google Doc transcript. And that is also a hyperlink. And so I just named it SalesBot. It's coming from a bot. Give it a nice little money bags icon, and I saved a link to this Zap. So this is a pretty straightforward way to build an automation. There's no path logic. It's just a straight flow of information, no delays. Gets right to the goal of sending a Slack message to the team and making sure that our insights have been taken out of the sales call, and all of those insights are saved both to Google Drive and to HubSpot. And to wrap this thing up, I'll just show a quick little vision of what it looks like in HubSpot for us. We've got all these emails, all the names, the contact owners, and then here are those fields I was talking about. You've got your action items, your goals, your objections, discovery questions, and important dates. And again, I created a custom view called recent calls, which is filtered based on action items being filled with information. So this is a little kind of finishing view of what it would look like if I wanted to see it in table format. And that's how, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about what's the real benefit here. Is it accessibility, or maybe is it scalability? I think that with prompt engineering and getting just really quick hitting bullet points on the objections and the discovery questions, having that in table format, I mean, if it's in HubSpot, it's great. I can go through row by row, but there are other AI tools you can give a spreadsheet to, and it'll analyze it and give you the top insights. So there are a lot of really cool tools out there that'll do that kind of qualitative data analysis now that I really love for things like this.
Yeah, and one thing, Grant, I did want to point out is like, which I think is a nice touch, is like, yeah, we're creating these summaries, we're categorizing them, we're creating Google Docs and storing them, but we're also, which I think is a nice touch, is notifications are being sent, or we can include the URL so that you can go exactly to something like straight away. And I think that's a good just balance to strike. It's like, because sometimes people work a little differently, right? It's like, oh, when something comes across and I see some details around this call, I might want to check it out right now. Like, this looks important. I can jump on it if I want, but then it's like, it doesn't get buried though. So it's like, I don't have to check that out right now, because I also know that we're categorizing it and we're putting it and storing it away so that I can get access to it later. And I think that's a nice thing to think about when we walk through these different types of workflows, is you can do both at the same time. It doesn't have to be an either or thing. And I think it's important to understand, because people work differently. Some people are on Slack and they like things that flow through, and I want to jump on something, and then other people a little bit more methodical about their day, and they'll do time blocks. Like, I'm going to take 11 to 12 and I'm going to go into Google Drive and I'm going to find the best sales calls to review. So I think it's also working in that context too. Jacob, after Grant goes through those details, like what pops into your mind as far as like some of the big things that marketers can get from these types of sales calls?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that we're making our marketing decisions based on real and holistic data, not just on the things that we're looking at in our marketing analytics, report that we're creating. Like, we can do things like use the ICP's own language. Like Grant was talking about those AI tools that will analyze the whole database of these things that you put into it. Well, we can pull quotes and get those quotes, the real words that are used, and put it in marketing material. We can better prioritize pain points. We can identify answers to questions we're not, or identify questions that we're not answering on the marketing material. So it's just a holistic view that I think most marketing teams don't have, is one of the big benefits of this.
Yeah, and Grant, what do you think folks should think about, at least from a marketing perspective, if I'm pushing to get this done and get some of these insights in? Like, what are some of the things I should think about as a marketer before I implement this type of workflow?
Start with the end in mind when you can. If you know what you're shooting for, that certainly helps, right? I think building automation in reverse can be really helpful if we know what our outputs are. And really thinking through, I think don't automate for automation's sake. I think that's another thing that people often fall into the trap of, is like, especially when they come to me, they think, oh, well, you're just trying to automate everything. It's like, there are some things that if you don't have a process yet, or you don't know how you want to use the data yet, as Jacob was saying, like, we're now using holistic data, but make sure you have the answer for what, right? So if we're going to generate all this stuff, know where you want to use it, then go back and build the automation to save the time, right? I don't want anyone to waste time building for automations for automation's sake, although it is very fun. It's very addicting. Make sure you know what you're doing with it.
Yeah, and back to like I'll close up here with this thought where, we talked about earlier, it's a big piece of marketing is getting details from sales calls and trying to pull that forward and get some of the messaging updated with actual dialogue that we're having with customers. I think it's just important as a marketer, and probably to your point, Grant, it's like, I need to understand like what I want out of this, right? Like, sure, sales calls, it's a nice thing that people say, but you really do have to think about it from a marketing perspective. Like, what are those key areas that I want? And that ties nicely in with how, like, you were breaking up the prompts. It's like, think of it as a one-to-one thing. Like, what do I want to know about every sales call? Is it the overall sentiment? Are there 3 to 4 takeaways I want to have? And then how can I use that information later? And I think it always just goes, working with the sales team goes both ways. Sometimes we need to provide them information from a marketing perspective. And I think this is a situation where we're reverse engineering things. It's like, we've passed these leads on, but now this feedback loop, we can control that as a marketer, and we can make the work that we do better, by pulling that information back. And the nice thing here, sales isn't really doing anything, right? So there is marketing and sales alignment, and we're actually building out this workflow to facilitate that, and they're not doing any extra work, which I think is a pretty big takeaway here. So thanks, gentlemen, for walking this through. Hopefully we can get some more marketing and sales alignment without, people having to do too much work, at least beyond what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So Grant, leave us with where folks can find out a little bit more information about you and, some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. You can find me on LinkedIn, Grant Hushek. I'm the only one. And then you've also got grantbot.co, all one word.
All right. Thanks again, gentlemen. Let's go apply this stuff right away, I would say.
Sounds good. Good talking to you guys.